The empty seat at the head of the table. It is 3 in the morning, and I have 5 industrial-grade floodlights pointed at every corner of my studio apartment. The electricity bill is going to be astronomical, but I don't care. I can't afford shadows. Not anymore. Shadows are where he lives. My neighbor 2 doors down is roasting a turkey early for a Friendsgiving party, and the smell drifting through the hallway vents, that savory, heavy scent of sage thyme and roasted meat, is making me retch into my kitchen sink. To anyone else, it smells like a holiday, like warmth, like family. To me, it smells like formaldehyde and old blood. It smells like the breath of something that should have stayed buried in the soil of the Appalachian foothills. I am gripping a steak knife so hard my knuckles have turned the color of parchment, and my eyes are fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the drywall to bow, waiting for the wet, heavy thud of a body dropping from above. I need to write this down while the caffeine is still overriding the terror, while I can still convince myself that I am the one in control. If you are reading this and you are planning to meet your significant other's family for the first time this holiday season, listen to me. If the house feels too quiet, if the traditions feel too rigid, if you see a chair that no one is allowed to sit in, run. Do not be polite. Politeness is the most dangerous reflex we have. It is the gag that keeps us silent while the guillotine blade drops. It started with a text message 8 months ago, and it ended with me speeding down a mountain road with a shattered windshield and a soul that had been irreparably stained. Her name was Sarah. That's what I'll call her, though even thinking the name now sends a phantom ache through the scar tissue on my forearm. We had been dating for the better part of a year, and everything about her was magnetic. She was vibrant, intelligent. A graphic designer with a laugh that could cut through the noise of a crowded bar. But there was always a frantic edge to her, a sort of high-functioning anxiety that she masked with self-deprecating humor and busy work. She never spoke about her family. When I asked, she would wave her hand dismissively and say they were traditional or old-fashioned words that I interpreted as meaning they were conservative Christians or perhaps just socially stiff. I didn't press. I was an orphan of the foster system, bounced around enough homes to know that family dynamics are complicated. And I respected her boundaries because I desperately wanted to build a new family of my own. I wanted to belong. That desire to belong was the first mistake. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, she asked me to come home with her. She was sitting on my couch, shredding the cuticle of her thumb with her teeth, a nervous habit I had tried to help her break. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading, and asked if I would drive up to the mountains with her. "They want to meet you, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a big deal. We don't usually bring outsiders in, but Grandpa is gone now, so maybe things are different." I agreed immediately. I saw it as a milestone, a validation of our relationship. I didn't see the way her shoulders slumped, not in relief but in resignation. I didn't see the way she looked at me, not with love, but with the mournful pity of someone watching a lamb wander toward a slaughterhouse chute. The drive took 3 hours, taking us out of the city limits and deep into the dense gray wilderness of the state's northern mountain range. The deeper we drove, the more the modern world seemed to peel away. The strip malls and gas stations were replaced by towering pines and oaks that had already shed their leaves, their bare branches clawing at the overcast sky like skeletal fingers. The cell service on my phone flickered from LTE to 3G, and then to a definitive no service, as we turned onto a gravel road that didn't appear on the GPS. The silence in the car was heavy. Sarah had stopped engaging in our usual banter hours ago. She was fixated on her phone, scrolling through nothing, her thumbnail now bitten down to the quick, a small bead of fresh blood welling up in the corner. "You okay, babe?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the winding road. The gravel crunched loudly under the tires, the only sound in the vast, oppressive quiet of the woods. "You seem tense." "Are they that strict? I promise I wore my best shirt. I even covered the tattoo on my arm." Sarah jumped as if I had shouted. She shoved her hand into her pocket, hiding the bleeding finger. "What? No, no, it's not that. It's been a long time since I've been back. My dad, he's intense, he has high standards, and Mom, she gets overwhelming. I just want everything to go perfectly." "It will," I assured her, reaching over to squeeze her knee. "I'm charming as hell. They'll love me." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were focused on the tree line, scanning the woods, as if she expected something to come running out of the underbrush. "Just follow my lead, Ethan, please. If they say something weird, just ignore it. If the food looks different, just eat it. Don't ask questions. They take tradition very seriously." "Understood," I said. "No politics, no religion, compliment the turkey. I got this." I didn't got this. We rounded a sharp bend, and the trees suddenly opened up to reveal a valley that felt like a crater on the moon, isolated and still. In the center of the clearing sat the house. It was a massive Victorian structure, a looming architectural beast of dark wood and stone that looked completely out of place in the rugged wilderness. It had turrets and wraparound porches blackened by age and weather. The windows were tall and narrow like judging eyes, and despite the gloomy afternoon light, not a single lamp was lit inside. It stood against the backdrop of the mountain like a dark stain on a canvas, imposing and utterly silent. "Wow," I breathed, slowing the car. "You didn't tell me you grew up in a haunted mansion." "It's not haunted," Sarah snapped, her voice sharp. She immediately softened, touching my arm. "Sorry, I'm just nervous. It's the ancestral home. The Thorns have lived here for 100 years. We parked on the gravel driveway. As soon as I cut the engine, the silence of the valley rushed in to fill the cabin. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind you feel in a deep cavern or a mausoleum. I stepped out, the cold mountain air biting through my jacket. I grabbed our bags from the trunk, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched from the dark windows on the second floor. The front door opened before we even reached the steps. A man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall, wearing a black suit that looked expensive but dated like something cut in the 1950s. His hair was silver and swept back severely from a high forehead. This was Mr. Thorn. He didn't smile. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching us approach with the stillness of a statue. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave. She walked up the steps and offered him a stiff hug, which he returned with a pat on the back that looked more like he was burping a baby than greeting his daughter. "Ursula," he said. His voice was deep, resonant, rattling in his chest like stones in a wooden box. "It's Sarah, Dad. I go by Sarah now," she corrected him quietly. He ignored her and turned his gaze to me. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they swept over me with a terrifying precision. He wasn't looking at my face, he was looking at my shoulders, my chest, the length of my arms. He was looking at me the way a butcher looks at a side of beef, assessing the marbling and the bone density. "And this is him," Mr. Thorn stated, not as a question. "This is Ethan," Sarah said, stepping between us slightly as if to shield me. "He's an architect. He lives in the city." Mr. Thorn extended a hand. I took it, expecting a standard handshake. His grip was iron. His skin was rough, calloused, and shockingly cold, like he had been handling ice blocks. He squeezed his fingers, digging into my palm, grinding the bones together. It wasn't a greeting, it was a stress test. I winced but held my ground, forcing myself not to pull away. "Solid grip," he muttered, finally releasing me. "Good frame, healthy. You look like you have stamina, Ethan." "I try to hit the gym when I can, sir," I stammered, rubbing my aching hand. "Thank you for welcoming me into your home." "Welcome is a strong word," he said, turning back toward the dark maw of the doorway. "We shall see if you fit." Before I could process the rudeness of that statement, the door swung open wider, and Mrs. Thorn spilled out. She was the polar opposite of her husband, a whirlwind of energy and color. She wore a floral dress that seemed too bright for the season, and her hair was done up in a tight, immaculate bun. But it was her face that made me take a subconscious step back. She was smiling a wide, stretched grin that showed too many teeth and didn't falter for a second. Her eyes, however, were terrified. They darted back and forth from me to Sarah to the sky, to her husband's back, never resting, never blinking. Oh, you must be Ethan," she shrieked, grabbing my coat with both hands. Look at him! Look at him! Silas would have loved him. He's so vital, so full of life." "Hi, Mom," Sarah said, trying to peel her mother off me. Come in, it's freezing out here and the wind carries whispers. You know, don't let the cold in." Mrs. Thorne ushered us inside, practically shoving me through the threshold. The interior of the house smelled of lemon polish and something else, something earthy and musk-like, hidden beneath the cleaning chemicals. The hallway was lined with dark oak paneling and heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the outside world. It was spotless, eerily so. There was no dust, no clutter, no sign that people actually lived here. It felt like a museum exhibit of a home preserved in amber. "Where is Grandma?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed. "In the parlor by the fire. She's been waiting," Mrs. Thorne said, her eyes vibrating in their sockets. "She's been so lucid today, Sarah. It's a miracle. I think she knows. I think she senses the occasion." We moved into the parlor. A fire was roaring in the oversized hearth, casting long dancing shadows against the walls. In a high-backed wing chair sat an old woman. She was incredibly frail, her skin like crumpled tissue paper draped over sharp bones. She was staring intently at the flames, her mouth moving in a silent rhythm. "Grandma," Sarah approached her slowly. "It's me, Sarah." The old woman stopped mouthing words. Her head turned slowly, the vertebrae in her neck audibly popping. She looked at Sarah with cloudy, cataract-filled eyes, then her gaze slid past her granddaughter and locked onto me. I smiled, trying to be the polite guest. "Hello, ma'am. I'm Ethan." She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She leaned forward, sniffing the air. Then her gaze dropped from my face to my neck. She stared at the jugular vein pulsing there. I felt a primal urge to cover my throat, a biological alarm bell ringing in my hindbrain, telling me that I was in the presence of a predator, however frail. "He feels warm," the grandmother whispered. Her voice was surprisingly steady, devoid of the tremor of age. "Is he for the chair?" Sarah froze. "Grandma, shh. He's my boyfriend. He's here for dinner." "For dinner?" The old woman repeated, a small, sly smile touching her withered lips. "Yes, good." "She has dementia," Mrs. Thorne interjected quickly, her voice shrill. "She doesn't know what she's saying. Half the time she thinks it's 1955. Come, let me show you the rest of the house before we eat. You must see the portrait. It's the pride of the family." I was all too happy to leave the parlor and that unblinking stare. I followed Sarah and her mother further down the hall, trying to shake the feeling that the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees when the old woman looked at me. "Don't mind her," Sarah whispered to me, squeezing my hand so hard her nails dug in. "She confuses people with past events." "What did she mean about the chair?" I asked. "Just nonsense." Old family stories. Sarah pulled me toward a massive oil painting hanging at the end of the corridor. "Here, this is Grandpa Silas." The portrait was life-size, dominating the space. It depicted an elderly man sitting in the same wing chair I had just seen in the parlor. He wore a dark suit similar to the one Mr. Thorne was wearing. His face was sharp, angular, with deep-set eyes and a cruel, thin mouth. But the artist had captured something in the eyes, a malevolence that felt alive. As I stood there looking up at the painted face, I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. The paint seemed to shimmer in the low light. "He died 3 years ago," Sarah said softly, staring at the canvas with a mixture of fear and reverence. "Cardiac arrest, right at the Thanksgiving table." "I'm sorry," I said automatically. "Don't be," Sarah murmured. "He lived a long time, longer than he should have. He was powerful." Everyone was terrified of him, even Dad. She paused, and for a second her mask slipped, revealing true terror. Sometimes I think he still runs things around here. Sometimes I think he never actually left. "Dinner is ready." Mrs. Thorne's voice echoed from the kitchen, shattering the moment. The sound of her voice made me jump. I looked back at the portrait, and I swear for a fraction of a second the eyes in the painting had shifted. They were no longer looking straight ahead. They were looking down directly at me. I blinked, and the painting was just a painting again. It's the lighting, I told myself. Just the flickering shadows from the hallway sconces. You're tired from the drive. You're letting the creepy atmosphere get to you. I was a man of science, of logic. Oil paint does not move. Dead men do not watch you from the wall. "Come on," Sarah said, tugging my arm. "We can't be late. Dad hates it when people are late to the table." We walked into the dining room, and the smell hit me. It should have been delicious. I could see the golden brown turkey sitting in the center of the long mahogany table. I could see the bowls of mashed potatoes, the stuffing, the cranberry sauce. But beneath the aroma of roasted poultry and sage, there was that smell again, the one I smell now in my apartment. It was a sweet, cloying rot. It smelled like meat that had been left out in the sun for a day too long, masked by heavy perfume. My stomach, which had been growling during the drive, suddenly clenched into a knot of hard dread. My body was rejecting the food before I had even tasted it. "Sit," Mr. Thorne commanded. He was standing at the head of the table, carving knife in hand. I looked at the table arrangement. There were 5 of us, Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, Sarah, the grandmother, who was being wheeled in by a nurse I hadn't seen before, and me. But there were 6 chairs. At the very head of the table, opposite Mr. Thorne sat a large, ornate chair with dark red velvet upholstery. It was different from the others, older, heavier. And unlike the other settings, which had standard white plates, the setting in front of this empty chair featured fine silver china and a goblet that looked like it belonged in a church communion. I moved to pull out the chair next to Sarah, which would have put me halfway down the table. "No!" Mr. Thorne barked. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I froze, hand on the back of the chair. "Sir, not there," Mr. Thorne said, pointing the tip of the carving knife toward the empty seat at the head of the table. "You sit there, to the right of the head." "The right of the head?" I asked, confused. "But isn't that chair empty?" "It is reserved for Grandpa Silas," Mrs. Thorne chirped, her smile trembling as she placed a napkin in her lap. "We always keep a place for him. Tradition. He likes to be included." "And the guest of honor sits at his right hand," Mr. Thorne said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Sit. The food is getting cold." I looked at Sarah. She was staring at her plate, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I swallowed the lump of bile rising in my throat. Logic, I told myself. It's just a weird, morbid tradition. Rich people do this kind of thing. They honor their ancestors. It's just a chair. It's just an empty chair. I walked to the designated spot right next to the red velvet throne. As I pulled out my chair, I brushed against the fabric of the empty seat. It was ice cold. Not room temperature cold. It felt like touching the exterior of a freezer. I sat down. The silence in the room was absolute. No one picked up a fork. No one moved. They were all watching me. Mr. Thorne, with the knife still in his hand, misses. Thorne with her manic, unblinking stare. The grandmother with her hungry predator eyes. Even Sarah was watching me now with a look of profound, apologetic sorrow. "We wait," Mr. Thorne said softly, "for the blessing." And in that moment, as the wind howled outside and the old house groaned under the weight of the coming night, I realized that the smell of rot wasn't coming from the turkey. It was coming from the empty chair beside me. The silence in the dining room was not simply an absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a pressurized atmospheric layer that pressed against my eardrums and made the simple act of inhaling feel like a labor. The room was illuminated by a grand crystal chandelier that hung directly above the table. But the bulbs were dim, casting a sickly yellowed light that failed to reach the corners of the room. The shadows there seemed to pool and thicken, defying the laws of optics. I found myself staring at the mahogany table, tracing the grain of the wood with my eyes desperate to look anywhere but at the empty chair beside me or the unblinking faces of the Thorne family. I was seated to the immediate right of the head of the table. To my left, the empty chair loomed. It was an antique high-backed armchair, upholstered in a velvet so dark it appeared black in the low light, though the fringes were a deep, dried blood crimson. The wood of the chair was carved with intricate twisting motifs that looked like vines or perhaps entrails wrapping around the legs and the armrests. It was pushed in slightly as if someone were already sitting there leaning forward to inspect the spread. The air radiating from that empty space was frigid. It wasn't a draft. I knew drafts. I was an architect. I knew how air circulated in old Victorian structures, how it seeped through single-pane glass and poorly insulated floorboards. This was different. This was a localized pocket of absolute zero, a stagnant sphere of cold that raised the hair on my left arm and sent phantom needles of ice pricking into my skin through the fabric of my dress shirt. So, Mrs. Thorne's voice shattered the silence, sharp and brittle as breaking glass. She was clasping her hands together so tightly that her knuckles were white, her elbows resting on the table in a breach of etiquette that seemed at odds with the rest of the formal setting. "Ethan, Sarah tells us you have no family, no parents to visit for the holidays." I flinched, not just at the sudden noise, but at the bluntness of the question. Sarah kicked me gently under the table, a frantic signal to play along to keep the peace. "That's correct, Mrs. Thorne," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, though it sounded thin and reedy in the cavernous room. "My parents passed when I was very young. I grew up in the foster system. I usually spend Thanksgiving with friends or working." "Foster care?" Mr. Thorne rumbled from the other end of the table. He hadn't sat down yet. He was standing behind the roast turkey, holding a carving knife and a two-pronged fork. The metal glinted under the chandelier. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the bird, analyzing its anatomy with surgical focus. So no lineage to speak of, no ties that bind. No one who would come looking if you were to, take an extended vacation. My stomach dropped. It was a threat veiled thinly as observation, but I forced a polite laugh that sounded more like a cough. "I suppose you could say I'm a free agent, sir, but I have close friends. People who worry." "Friends are transient," Mr. Thorne muttered, plunging the fork into the breast of the turkey. The sound of the metal piercing the crispy skin and sinking into the meat was wet and audible. "Blood is the only currency that holds value in this world. Blood remembers." He began to carve. If silence had been heavy before, it was now suffocating. The only sound in the room was the sawing motion of the knife. It wasn't a sharp knife. I realized with a jolt of horror that the blade was dull. Mr. Thorne wasn't slicing the meat. He was tearing it. He sawed back and forth with grim determination, the metal screeching against the turkey's rib cage, a rhythmic shirker, shirker that set my teeth on edge. He was putting his weight into it, his shoulders bunching under the fabric of his suit, severing joints with brute force rather than finesse. I watched mesmerized and repulsed as slabs of grayish-white meat fell onto the platter. The juice ran out, pooling around the carcass, dark and gelatinous. It didn't look like turkey gravy. It looked too thick. "Hungry mother, Mrs. Thorne?" asked the old woman, her voice pitching up into a nursery rhyme cadence. "Grandma's hungry, isn't she?" The grandmother, who had been staring catatonically at the centerpiece, a cornucopia filled with rotting gourds and dried corn, snapped her head toward the turkey. Her tongue, pale and coated, darted out to wet her lips. "He eats first," the grandmother croaked. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering on pavement. She didn't look at the food. She looked at the empty chair beside me. "Silas eats first, then the boy, then us." "Mother, hush," Mr. Thorne snapped, though he didn't stop sawing at the bird. "Don't be rude. Ethan is our guest. He takes the first portion." "But the master is hungry," the grandmother whined, a high, keening sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "I can hear his stomach growling. Can't you hear it, boy? Can't you hear him?" She pointed a crooked finger at me. I don't hear anything," I lied. But that wasn't entirely true. Beneath the screeching of the carving knife, beneath the wind howling outside the window, I did hear something. It was faint, barely on the edge of perception, like the sound of wet leather stretching or joints popping softly. It was coming from my left, from the chair. "Just ignore her, Ethan," Sarah whispered, her face pale. She was staring at her water glass as if she could divine a way out of there from the condensation patterns. "Please, just eat whatever Dad gives you. Don't make a scene." Mr. Thorne finished his butchery. He laid the knife down the blade, smeared with grease and dark fluid. He picked up the platter. I expected him to pass it to Mrs. Thorne or perhaps to Sarah. Instead, he walked the length of the long table, the floorboards groaning under his heavy, deliberate steps. He stopped beside me. He didn't serve the empty chair. He served me. He used the tongs to drop a massive pile of meat onto my porcelain plate. It hit the china with a wet slap. Then came a mound of stuffing that looked like gray sludge and a ladle of cranberry sauce that was so dark it looked black. "Eat," Mr. Thorne commanded, looming over me. He smelled of old sweat and iron filings. "Thank you, sir," I murmured. I picked up my fork. My hand was shaking. I tried to hide it by gripping the utensil until my knuckles turned white. I looked around the table. No one else had been served. Mr. Thorne returned to his seat at the far end, sat down, and folded his hands on the table. Mrs. Thorne was watching me with that manic, frozen smile, her eyes wide and expectant. Sarah looked like she was about to be sick, her hand covering her mouth. The grandmother was leaning forward in her wheelchair, drool gathering at the corner of her mouth, watching my fork. Aren't you all going to eat?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The guest partakes first," Mrs. Thorne said, nodding encouragingly. "It's the rule." "We cannot begin until you have accepted the family's bounty. It seals the hospitality. Eat, Ethan. It's delicious. My husband prepared it specially. Accept the bounty. Seal the hospitality." The phrasing was archaic, ritualistic. It sounded less like a dinner party and more like a contract negotiation. I looked at the meat on my fork. It was stringy and gray. I told myself it was just a turkey, just a dry, overcooked turkey prepared by a weird, intense man in a creepy house. I was hungry. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. My body needed fuel. I lifted the fork to my mouth. The smell of rot grew stronger as the food got closer to my face, clashing violently with the aroma of sage. I held my breath and shoved the meat into my mouth. I chewed. The texture was wrong. It was mushy, devoid of the natural grain of poultry, yet interspersed with hard, gritty bits that crunched between my molars. It tasted metallic, like sucking on a penny, with an underlying sourness that made my salivary glands spasm in rejection. It tasted like fear. It tasted like something that had died in terror. I gagged, a violent reflex that I barely managed to suppress into a cough. I covered my mouth with my napkin, forcing myself to swallow the lump of meat. It slid down my esophagus like a stone, scratching all the way down. Delicious. I choked out tears welling in my eyes. Very unique seasoning. "Good," Mr. Thorne said. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders relaxed slightly. He accepts." "He accepts." Mrs. Thorne clapped her hands together, a sharp, jarring sound. "Oh, wonderful. Now we are all family. Now we are all connected." As if on cue, the rest of the family began to serve themselves. But they didn't pass the platters. They didn't use the serving spoons. Mrs. Thorne reached out and grabbed a handful of stuffing with her bare hand, shoving it onto her plate. Sarah, to my horror, took a drumstick and began tearing at it with her teeth, her eyes vacant and glazed over as if she were in a trance. I sat there, my fork hovering over my plate, unable to take another bite. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air had grown heavier, charged with static electricity. "Tell me, Ethan," Mr. Thorne said, his voice cutting through the sound of wet chewing. "As an architect, you understand structure. You understand that a house cannot stand without a strong foundation." "Yes, sir," I replied, taking a sip of water to wash away the metallic taste in my mouth. The water was lukewarm and tasted of rust. "Families are the same," he continued, staring at me with those pale, dead eyes. "They require a foundation. Sometimes that foundation weakens, rot sets in, beams crack. When that happens, you don't abandon the house. You repair it. You replace the weak materials with new strong ones. You shore it up. Do you understand?" "I think so," I said, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "You value legacy." "I value survival," he corrected. "We are the Thorns. We have held this valley for 6 generations. We have survived blights, wars, and death itself, because we know how to maintain the structure. We know what must be done to keep the roof from collapsing." Beside me, the empty chair creaked. It wasn't the floorboards. It was the wood of the chair itself groaning as if weight shifted upon it. I froze. I slowly turned my head to the left. The velvet cushion was depressed. I stared at it, my brain trying to process the visual data. The plush red cushion, which had been smooth a moment ago, was now indented in the center as if an invisible pair of hips were resting there. The indentation was deep-heavy. "Is something wrong, Ethan?" Mrs. Thorne asked. Her mouth was smeared with cranberry sauce, making it look like she had been drinking blood. She wasn't eating anymore. She was just watching me stare at the chair. The chair," I stammered, pointing a shaking finger. "The cushion, it's—" "Grandpa Silas had a bad back," Sarah said suddenly. Her voice was monotone, robotic. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight ahead at the wall. "He shifted his weight a lot. Even now." "Even now," I whispered. "Sarah, he's dead." "Death is just a change of state," the grandmother mumbled, spitting a piece of gristle onto her plate. "Ice to water, water to steam, steam to breath." I pushed my chair back the legs, screeching against the hardwood floor. "I need to use the restroom," I said, my voice rising in panic. "I'm sorry, I don't feel well." "Sit down," Mr. Thorne commanded. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was absolute. It wasn't a request. It was an order given to a dog. "I really need a moment," I insisted, starting to stand. "I said sit, mister." Thorne slammed his fist onto the table. The china rattled. The wine glasses shook. I sat. My legs gave out more than I chose to obey. I collapsed back onto the hard wood of my chair, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "We have not said grace," Mr. Thorne said, his face darkening. "You have eaten the flesh, but you have not blessed the provider. To leave now would be an insult to the host." "The host?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "You mean God?" Mr. Thorne smiled. It was the first time he had smiled since I arrived. It was a slow stretching of the lips that revealed teeth stained pink from the meat. It was a smile devoid of mirth, devoid of humanity. "We give thanks to the provider," he said ambiguously. "The one who watches, the one who waits." I looked down at my lap, trying to compose myself, trying to formulate a plan. I needed to get Sarah, and we needed to leave. We would run to the car. If the car didn't start, we would walk. I didn't care about the cold. I didn't care about the darkness. Anything was better than this room, than these people. As I stared at my lap, something caught my eye under the table. The tablecloth was lace, hanging halfway to the floor, but through the gaps in the fabric I could see the space beneath the table. I saw Mr. Thorne's feet. He wasn't wearing shoes. He wasn't wearing socks. His feet were bare, resting on the cold wood floor. But they weren't human feet. They were gray and elongated, the structure of the bones twisted and stretched. The toes were unnaturally long curled, like the talons of a bird of prey, and tipped with thick black nails that looked more like claws. They were caked in dried mud and something else, something dark and flaky. As I watched one of the toes twitch, scratching against the floorboard with a sound like a rat gnawing on wood. Skirt, skirt. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. My eyes shot up to Mr. Thorne's face. He was staring directly at me, his expression calm, knowing. He knew I had seen. He didn't care. "Let us pray," Mr. Thorne announced, standing up. The family stood up in unison. Sarah rose like a puppet pulled by strings. Mrs. Thorne stood wiping her bloody mouth on her sleeve. Even the grandmother tried to push herself up from her wheelchair, her frail arms trembling with the effort before collapsing back with a hiss of frustration. "Stand, Ethan," Mr. Thorne said. I stood. My legs felt like lead. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a whoosh-whoosh sound that drowned out the wind outside. "Join hands," Mr. Thorne ordered. Mrs. Thorne reached out and grabbed my right hand. Her skin was hot, feverishly so, and moist with sweat and grease. She squeezed my hand tight, her fingernails digging into my palm. I looked to my left. There was no one there, just the empty chair. "Close the circle, Ethan," Mr. Thorne said, his eyes boring into mine. "Take his hand. There's no one there," I whispered, tears finally spilling over my cheeks. "Please, stop this. There's no one there. Take his hand." I looked at the space above the empty chair. The air was shimmering, distorting like heat haze, but cold. I could feel the cold emanating from it, rolling off in waves. I slowly, terrified, reached my left hand out into the empty air. I expected to grab nothing. I expected my hand to close on empty space, proving them all crazy, proving that this was just a mass delusion. Instead, my fingers brushed against something. It was invisible, but it was solid. It felt like skin, but freezing cold and leathery. I felt fingers, long, thin, skeletal fingers, curl around mine. They were strong. They gripped my hand with a crushing force that made my bones grind together. I gasped, trying to pull away, but the invisible grip held me fast. I was tethered to the empty air, holding hands with a void that had mass and intent. "Oh, great ancestor," Mr. Thorne began, his voice booming, echoing off the walls. "We thank you for this gathering. We thank you for the vessel you have brought to us." Vessel. The word hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. "We thank you for the flesh," the family chanted in unison. Even Sarah. "We thank you for the blood." "We offer you this harvest," Mr. Thorne shouted, looking up at the ceiling. "Fresh and young, strong of frame. A house worthy of your spirit." The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in white clouds of vapor. The frost began to creep across the mahogany table, turning the spilled gravy into dark ice. The invisible hand squeezing mine tightened, crushing my knuckles. I cried out in pain, but the sound was lost in the rising chant of the family. "Take him!" Grandma shrieked, her eyes rolling back into her head. "Take him, wear him. Accept the gift, missus." Thorne screamed, shaking my hand violently. "Dad, please." Sarah cried out, breaking the chant, her voice cracking with terror. "Not yet! He's not ready!" "Silence!" Mr. Thorne roared. He looked at me. "Open your heart, Ethan, or he will break it open for you." "I want to leave," I sobbed, struggling against the invisible grip. "Let me go." "The door is closed," Mr. Thorne said. "The pact is sealed with the first bite. You are part of the house now." Suddenly, the chandelier above us began to sway. The crystals tinkled like wind chimes in a hurricane. The light bulbs flickered, buzzing, angrily dimming, then flaring bright white. Pop, pop, pop. One by one, the bulbs exploded, raining showers of hot glass down onto the table, onto the turkey, onto our heads. I ducked, shielding my face with my free arm, but my left hand was still held fast by the invisible entity. Then the last bulb shattered. Darkness slammed into the room like a physical blow. Absolute pitch-black darkness. The chanting stopped. The wind outside stopped. The only sound in the room was the sound of my own ragged breathing and the sound of the grip on my hand releasing, only to be replaced by the sensation of something wet and heavy landing on the table with a sickening thud. And then right next to my ear, a voice. Not a human voice. It sounded like two stones grinding together, layered over the wet gurgle of a slit throat. "You taste afraid," I screamed. I screamed, but the sound didn't seem to leave my throat. It was swallowed by the sudden suffocating darkness that had descended upon the dining room like a heavy wool blanket. The explosion of the light bulbs had left a ringing in my ears, a high-pitched tinnitus that competed with the thundering rhythm of my own heart. The air was thick with the acrid smell of ozone and burnt tungsten layering over the existing stench of rotting meat and old blood. "Stay where you are," Mrs. Thorne's voice shrieked from somewhere to my right. It wasn't a warning for my safety. It was a command to keep the livestock in the pen. The candles. Silas cannot see the vessel without the ceremonial candles. I need the tallow. Where are the matches? "Woman, cease your wailing," Mr. Thorne's voice rumbled. It came from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the walls in the pitch black. "He does not need eyes to see. He smells the fear. The fear is the beacon." I scrambled backward my chair, toppling over with a deafening crash that echoed in the void. My hands flailed in front of me, desperate to find a purchase, to find a weapon, to find anything that wasn't the cold, invisible skin of the thing that had just been holding my hand. "Sarah!" I gasped, my voice cracking. "Sarah, where are you? We need to go, now!" There was no answer. "Sarah," I yelled, louder, panic shredding my vocal cords. "I'm here, Ethan." Her voice came from the other side of the room, near the kitchen door. It was calm, terrifyingly, utterly calm. It lacked the tremor of fear that had been there moments ago. It was the voice of someone watching a play they had seen a dozen times before, knowing exactly when the trapdoor opens. "Just wait. It's better if you don't fight it. Fighting makes the meat sour. Grandpa hates sour meat." "What are you talking about?" I scrabbled at the floor, backing away on my hands and knees. The hardwood was slick with something wet gravy water, or perhaps the blood from the raw meat they had been consuming. "Sarah, this is insanity. Open the door." "The doors are for the living," Mr. Thorne said, his voice closer now. I could hear the heavy thump-drag of his footsteps. He wasn't walking like a man anymore. He was shuffling, his weight distinct and uneven, like a bipedal animal learning to balance. "You are in the transition, boy. You are between the threshold of the house and the threshold of the flesh. Get away from me." I kicked out into the darkness. My foot connected with something solid, a table leg perhaps, and pain shot up my shin. Then silence returned. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. The chaos of Mrs. Thorne scrambling for candles had ceased. The shuffling of Mr. Thorne had stopped. Even Sarah's breathing was inaudible. I was alone in the dark. I squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again, desperate for my vision to adjust. Slowly, agonizingly, the room began to take shape. The storm outside had momentarily cleared the clouds, allowing a beam of pale, sickly moonlight to slice through the high windows. It cut across the dining room like a spotlight, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the disturbed air. The beam of light fell directly across the table. It illuminated the ruin of the feast. The turkey carcass, hacked and torn, looked like a roadkill autopsy. The wine glasses were overturned, bleeding dark red stains into the white lace tablecloth. And there, sitting in the shadows just on the edge of the light, was the grandmother. She hadn't moved. While everyone else had scattered or transformed, she sat in her wheelchair, perfectly still. Her head was turned toward me. In the moonlight, her cataracts looked like two milky orbs of polished marble. She was smiling. Not the vacant, senile smile from before, but a sharp, lucid grin that stretched her wrinkled skin to the breaking point. "Come here, boy," she whispered. I froze. I was huddled on the floor near the sideboard, clutching a heavy silver candlestick I had managed to grab from a side table. "Stay back," I warned, brandishing the candlestick. "I swear to God I'll use this." "God isn't in this valley, Ethan," she chuckled. The sound was wet, like phlegm bubbling in a lung. "God stopped at the state line. Here we have only the family and the hunger." She wheeled herself forward. The rubber tires of her chair squeaked against the floorboards. Squeak, squeak. Squeak! She stopped right at the edge of the moonlight. She extended a hand toward me. "Look," she commanded. She pointed a crooked finger toward the head of the table. "Look at where you sat. Look at the honor you were given." I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep my eyes on the exits, to find a window I could smash. But the compulsion was overwhelming. It was as if her voice had hooked into the base of my spine and yanked my head around. I looked at the empty chair. The moonlight hit it perfectly. The red velvet cushion was still depressed, a deep, heavy crater in the fabric that defied the laws of physics, as if a 300-pound man were currently sitting there invisible. But it was the tablecloth that made my blood turn to ice. On the pristine white lace, right where the invisible guest's hands would be resting, stains were appearing. I watched, paralyzed with horror, as the fabric began to darken. It wasn't a spill spreading outward. It was a manifestation. First, the heel of a palm appeared in crimson red, then the thumb, then one by one the long, skeletal fingers. Bloody handprints were forming on the table, pressed down by invisible hands. The blood was fresh. It glistened in the moonlight, bright arterial red. And as I watched, the invisible fingers tapped. Tap, tap, tap. I saw the fabric depress with each tap. The sound was soft, wet, and rhythmic. It was a sign of impatience. "He likes you," the grandmother whispered. She was right beside me now. I hadn't heard her move. Her hand shot out and clamped onto my wrist. I screamed and tried to yank my arm away, but her grip was supernatural. This frail woman, who looked like a stiff breeze could knock her over, held me with the strength of a hydraulic press. Her fingernails, long and yellow and sharp as talons, dug into my flesh, puncturing the skin. I felt warm blood trickle down my forearm. "Let go!" I shouted, striking at her hand with the candlestick. She didn't even flinch. She just leaned closer, her face inches from mine. She smelled of mothballs and rotting earth. "He likes the shape of you," she hissed, her eyes widening until I could see the red veins in the whites. "He says your bones are dense. He says your skin is elastic. It will stretch well. It won't tear like the last one." "The last one," I stammered, terror overriding the pain in my wrist. "The one before you," she said, nodding toward the ceiling. "He was too soft. He tore at the seams when Silas tried to wear him. A waste, a terrible waste of meat. But you are sturdy, Ethan. You are a good suit." "I am not a suit," I roared. Adrenaline flooded my system. I swung the candlestick with all my might, aiming not at her hand, but at the armrest of her wheelchair. The impact rang out clang, and the vibration jarred her grip just enough. I ripped my arm free, tearing a chunk of skin in the process. I scrambled backward, crab-walking away from her, gasping for air. "You can't run," she cackled, rubbing her hand where I had struck the chair. "He's already marked you. You felt the drip, didn't you? You felt the baptism." The drip. I remembered the cold liquid that had landed on my forehead right before the lights went out. I reached up and touched my forehead. My fingers came away slick with a dark, viscous substance. I looked at it in the moonlight. It wasn't water, it was black bile, thick and tar-like. And then I heard it, above me. It wasn't a footstep. It was the sound of adhesion. A wet, sticky schluck sound, like a boot being pulled out of deep mud, followed by a soft cracking noise. Crack, snap, pop. It sounded like knuckles cracking, but amplified a dozen times. It was the sound of joints being forced into angles they were never meant to accommodate. "He's awake," Sarah said from the darkness. Her voice was filled with a twisted awe. "Look up, Ethan." It's rude not to look at the host. I didn't want to look up. I knew that if I looked up, my mind would break. I knew that whatever was clinging to the ceiling of this Victorian dining room was something that biology had no name for, but the sound was directly above my head. The breathing was wet. It sounded like air bubbling through a chest cavity filled with fluid. I slowly, trembling violently, tilted my head back. The moonlight caught it. Clinging to the plaster ceiling directly above the chandelier was a monstrosity. It was vaguely humanoid, but that was where the comfort ended. Its limbs were impossibly long, composed of too many joints, allowing it to sprawl across the ceiling like a granddaddy long-legged spider. The arms and legs were twisted backward, the elbows and knees poking out at sharp, sickening angles. Its skin was the color of a bruised plum pulled so tight over its skeleton that I could see every ridge of the spine, every rib. But it was the face that stopped my heart. It was upside down, hanging toward me. It was the face from the portrait Grandpa Silas. But it was stripped of humanity. The jaw was unhinged, hanging loosely against the chest, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth that looked like they had been filed to points. The eyes. Oh God, the eyes. They were glowing, not reflecting light like a cat, but generating their own luminescence. Two burning circles of sulphurous yellow, devoid of pupils, staring down at me with an ancient, hungry intelligence. Saliva-thick, ropey strands of it hung from its open maw, dripping steadily onto the table below. Drip, drip, drip. Well, come. The voice didn't come from its mouth. Its mouth hung slack and useless. The voice seemed to emanate from its chest, a vibrating, grinding sound that resonated in my own ribcage. Gah, ye. My name is Ethan. I screamed the absurdity of correcting a demon on my name, lost in the sheer terror of the moment. The creature's head cocked to the side, the neck snapping audibly. Ethan! It corrected the sound like stones grinding in a blender. Viet. Beater. No, I whispered. No, no, no. The creature's muscles bunched. I saw the tension ripple through its emaciated frame. It released its grip on the ceiling. It didn't fall clumsily. It dropped with terrifying precision. I threw myself to the side, rolling across the floor just as the creature landed where I had been standing a second ago. Crack! It hit the floorboards on all fours, the impact shaking the entire room. It didn't sprawl. It landed in a crouch, its four limbs planted, its head hovering inches from the ground. It looked like a gargoyle come to life. I scrambled to my feet, slipping on the slick floor, and bolted for the hallway. "Don't let him leave the room, mister!" Thorne roared. I saw a shadow loom up in the doorway leading to the kitchen. It was Mr. Thorne. He was holding something massive, a meat cleaver. He swung it. I ducked, feeling the wind of the blade pass inches over my head. The cleaver bit into the door frame with a sound like a gunshot burying itself deep in the wood. I didn't stop to fight him. I pivoted my sneakers, squeaking on the blood-slicked floor, and ran toward the main hallway toward the front door. "The doors are locked, boy!" Mrs. Thorne shrieked from the darkness. She sounded like she was laughing and crying at the same time. "We melted the keys. We gave them to the fire." I reached the massive oak front door. I grabbed the handle and twisted. It wouldn't budge. I threw my shoulder against it. It was like hitting a concrete wall. I looked at the lock. The keyhole was gone, filled with molten lead that had hardened. She wasn't lying. They had sealed us in. Behind me, I heard a skittering sound. Click, clack, click, clack. Fast. Too fast for a human. I turned. The creature Silas was scuttling down the hallway toward me. It moved on its hands and feet. Its back arched high, its head twisting back and forth. It moved with the jerky, stop-motion speed of an insect. "Get away!" I screamed. I grabbed a vase from a hallway table and hurled it. The vase smashed against the creature's shoulder. It didn't even slow down. It just hissed a sound like a high-pressure steam valve opening. I couldn't go out. I couldn't go back to the dining room. I looked up. The staircase. I lunged for the stairs, taking them two at a time. My breath burned in my lungs like fire. I could hear the thing hitting the bottom steps behind me. Thump, click, thump, click. I reached the landing of the second floor. The hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with closed doors. It seemed longer than it had been earlier. The perspective felt warped like a hallway in a nightmare that stretches as you run. I didn't think. I just chose a door at random, the third one on the left, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I fumbled for the lock. It was an old-fashioned sliding bolt. I rammed it home just as something slammed into the other side of the door. Boom! The wood bowed inward. Dust rained down from the frame. "Ethan!" Sarah's voice came from the other side of the door. She wasn't whispering anymore. She was right there. "Open the door, honey. You're just delaying the inevitable. It's better if you accept it. The struggle makes the bonding painful. If you relax, he can slide right in. It's just like putting on a coat." "You're sick!" I yelled, backing away from the door. "You're all sick cultist freaks." "We are survivors," she screamed back, her voice losing its composure. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I chose this? It's the pact." "We give him a body every generation, and he gives us the valley. He gives us the wealth. He keeps the crops from dying. It's a trade, Ethan, a fair trade." "I'm not currency," I shouted. Boom! The door cracked down the center. A long splinter of wood shot into the room. Through the crack, I saw a flash of yellow eyes. I spun around, scanning the room for a weapon, a window, anything. My eyes adjusted to the dim light. I realized where I was. I wasn't in a guest room. I was in a walk-in closet. But it was enormous, larger than my entire apartment. And it was filled with clothes. Rows and rows of suits hung on racks. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't hanging on hangers. They were hanging on hooks. And the hooks were pierced through the backs of necks. I stifled a scream, clamping both hands over my mouth. They weren't suits. They were skins. Dried, tanned human skins. They hung limply, arms dangling, empty faces staring blankly at the floor. I saw a tuxedo. I saw a denim jacket with the skin still attached underneath. I saw a leather biker vest fused to a torso. And on the shelf above them there were photographs, Polaroids. I stepped closer, drawn by a horrified curiosity I couldn't control. The photos were taped to the edge of the shelf. Each one showed a young man, a handsome guy in a varsity jacket, a man in a military uniform, a guy with long hair and a guitar, and written in Sharpie under each photo were names and dates. Michael, 1985, David, 1994, Jonathan, 2003, Chris, 2015. Previous boyfriends, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the gut. Sarah hadn't been unlucky in love. She had been a recruiter, a black widow spider spinning a web for a monster that wore her lovers like seasonal fashion. "Do you like the collection?" I spun around. Sarah was standing in the corner of the room. I hadn't seen her. There was a second door, a connecting door to the bedroom that was slightly ajar. She was holding a lantern. The light cast deep shadows on her face, making her look skeletal. She was crying, tears streaming down her face, but her expression was one of stony resolve. In her hand she held a length of thick, braided rope. "Sarah," I pleaded, holding my hands up. "Look at this. Look at these people. This isn't survival. This is hell. You can stop this. We can leave. We can burn this place down." "He's already inside the room, Ethan," she said softly. I looked at the main door. The creature wasn't banging on it anymore. The silence was worse than the noise. I heard a scratching sound. Above me, inside the closet. I looked up. There was an access hatch to the attic in the ceiling of the closet. It was open, a square of darkness, and descending from that darkness, hanging by its feet like a bat, was Grandpa Silas. He was silent now. He hung directly over me, his face inches from mine. The smell of formaldehyde and ancient dust washed over me. "Fun!" I didn't scream this time. My brain simply short-circuited. I reacted on pure instinct. I shoved a rack of suits toward the creature. The dried skins flapped and tangled around its limbs. It roared a sound of pure frustration and slashed at the skins, tearing them apart. I took the opportunity. I tackled Sarah. I hit her with my shoulder, knocking the wind out of her. We crashed to the floor. The lantern skittered away, spinning wildly, casting strobe light shadows across the macabre room. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, clawing at my face. I'm sorry, but he needs you." "I don't care," I yelled. I scrambled off her and ran for the connecting door she had entered through. I burst into a bedroom, Sarah's bedroom. It was pink and frilly, a grotesque contrast to the slaughterhouse next door. I saw a window. I didn't check if it was locked. I didn't check the drop. I picked up a heavy vanity chair and hurled it through the glass. Crash! The cold mountain air rushed in sweet and clean compared to the rot of the house. I heard the creature tearing through the closet door behind me. I heard Mr. Thorne's heavy boots thundering down the hall. I climbed onto the windowsill. I looked down. It was a 15-foot drop to a dense hedge of holly bushes. "Ethan!" Sarah screamed from the doorway. She was standing there, the creature looming behind her, its long, spindly hand resting on her shoulder like a possessive pet owner. "Don't, you'll break your legs, he'll catch you anyway, just give in." The creature's jaw unhinged. It lunged over Sarah's shoulder, its arm stretching out like a striking snake, fingers grasping for my ankle. "Go to hell," I spat. I jumped. The fall felt like it lasted forever. I had time to see the moon, the dark outline of the trees, the gravel driveway where my car sat mocking me. Then I hit the bushes. The branches whipped me, tearing at my clothes and skin. I crashed through the foliage and hit the frozen ground hard. Snap! A blinding white bolt of pain shot up my right leg. I screamed, rolling onto my back, clutching my ankle. It was bent at a sickening angle, broken, definitely broken. I gasped for air, fighting the black spots dancing in my vision. I had to move. If I stayed here, I was dead. I looked up at the window I just jumped from. Silas was there. He was squeezed into the window frame, his limbs contorted to fit. He was staring down at me. But he didn't jump. He just smiled, his yellow eyes burning in the night. He turned his head and whispered something to Sarah, who was standing beside him. Then slowly he pulled himself back into the darkness of the house. He wasn't coming out. Why wasn't he coming out? Then I heard the back door of the house slam open. I heard the roar of an engine, not a car engine, a chainsaw. Mr. Thorne stepped out onto the back porch, bathed in the floodlight. He was holding a rusted, smoking chainsaw. He revved it. "Vroom! Run, rabbit!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the valley walls. "The hunt honors the meat run." I rolled onto my stomach. I dug my fingers into the frozen dirt. I couldn't run, but I could crawl. I dragged myself toward the woods, my broken leg trailing behind me like a dead weight, as the sound of the chainsaw grew closer. The sound of a chainsaw is distinct. It is a mechanical scream, a tearing of the air that vibrates in your teeth. But hearing it in a suburban backyard on a Sunday afternoon is one thing. Hearing it in a frozen valley while you drag a broken leg through dead leaves and frost is the sound of your own impending autopsy. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The pain in my right ankle was a blinding white supernova that eclipsed every other sensation. My foot flopped uselessly behind me, held on only by skin and tendon, catching on every root and stone. I dug my fingers into the half-frozen mud, pulling myself forward inch by agonizing inch toward the gravel driveway. Drag, gasp, drag, gasp. Behind me, the roar of the engine grew louder, mixed with Mr. Thorne's heavy, wet breathing. He wasn't running. He was stalking. He knew I was crippled. He was savoring the terror, letting the marinade soak into the meat. "The bone must be exposed," he bellowed, his voice cracking with religious ecstasy. "The marrow is the seal. Don't deny the ritual, Ethan." I reached the gravel. The sharp stones sliced my palms, but I didn't care. My car, my beat-up reliable sedan, was 10 feet away. It looked like a spaceship, a beacon of modern technology and safety in a world gone primal. I fumbled in my pocket for the keys. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped them into the dark gravel. If I dropped them, I was dead. I knew that with absolute certainty. Vroom! The chainsaw bit into the trunk of a pine tree just to my left, showering me with wood chips and bark. I screamed and rolled, scrambling the last few feet on my back. Mr. Thorne towered over me, silhouetted against the floodlights of the house. He looked like a giant, the chainsaw idling in his hands, dripping oil and smoke. His suit was ruined, stained with grease and turkey blood. "You have spirit," he grunted, tilting his head. "Silas will enjoy breaking it." He raised the saw. I jammed the key into the remote unlock button, praying the battery hadn't died in the cold. Beep, beep. The sound was the sweetest music I had ever heard. I threw myself at the driver's side door, wrenching it open. I practically fell into the seat, dragging my shattered leg inside. A jolt of nausea washed over me as the bone ground against the doorframe, but I swallowed the vomit. Mr. Thorne brought the saw down. Screech! The chain sparked against the metal of the doorframe inches from my face. I slammed the door shut, locking it instantly. He didn't pull back. He didn't try the handle. He dropped the chainsaw. It clattered to the ground, the engine sputtering out. He jumped onto the hood of my car. The suspension groaned under his weight. He was on all fours, staring at me through the windshield. His face was inches from mine, separated only by a layer of safety glass. He wasn't human anymore. His eyes were rolled back so far only the whites showed. He raised his fists, hammer-sized blocks of scarred flesh, and brought them down. Thud. The glass didn't break. "Open it!" he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "You are offending the host." Thud. A spiderweb crack appeared in the center of the windshield. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, whined, and caught. Mr. Thorne stopped punching. He looked at the dashboard lights illuminating my face. He smiled. Then he reared his head back. He slammed his forehead into the windshield. Crack! Blood smeared across the glass, a dark, thick smear. He did it again and again, rhythmic, brutal. He was using his own skull as a battering ram. With each impact, the safety glass bowed inward, showering the dashboard with tiny, glittering diamonds. His forehead was a ruin of split skin and exposed bone, but he didn't stop. He didn't feel pain. He only felt the hunger of the house. "I am the gatekeeper," he gargled, blood bubbling from his mouth. I shifted the car into reverse. "Get off my car!" I screamed. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun on the loose gravel, spraying stones before finding traction. The car shot backward. Mr. Thorne lost his grip. He slid off the hood, his fingernails screeching down the paint, leaving 4 deep gouges in the metal. He tumbled onto the driveway, rolling once before springing back to his feet with impossible agility. I spun the wheel, throwing the car into a J-turn that sent agonizing shockwaves up my leg. I shifted into drive and floored it. In the rearview mirror, bathed in the red glow of my taillights, I saw them. They were standing on the porch. Sarah, Mrs. Thorne, the grandmother. And behind them, clinging to the porch pillars like a spider, was Silas. Sarah raised her hand. She wasn't waving goodbye. She was waving, "Come here." Her mouth moved, and even though I was 50 yards away inside a roaring car, I heard her voice whisper in my ear as clearly as if she were sitting in the passenger seat. "He marked you, Ethan. You can't outrun your own blood." I didn't stop driving until I hit the state line. I didn't stop when the windshield finally caved in from the wind pressure. I didn't stop when my gas light came on. I drove until the sun came up, until the adrenaline crashed and the pain took over, and I passed out in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner 3 counties away. The police report was exactly what you would expect. A hysterical man covered in cuts, claiming a prominent wealthy family tried to feed him to their undead grandfather. They investigated, of course. They went to the house, and they found nothing. The house was there, yes, but it was empty, not just uninhabited, abandoned. Dust sheets covered the furniture. The refrigerator was unplugged and empty. There was no turkey, no blood on the table, no clothes made of skin in the closet. The portrait of Grandpa Silas was gone, leaving only a rectangular clean spot on the faded wallpaper. The police told me I had likely suffered a psychotic break brought on by stress. They said I had broken into an empty summer home, hallucinated a dinner party, and jumped out a window in a panic. They pointed to the lack of evidence. They pointed to my history in foster care, my lack of a support system. They called me unstable. Sarah's phone number was disconnected. Her social media accounts vanished. It was as if she had never existed. I lost my job. I lost my apartment. I spent 6 months in physical therapy learning to walk on an ankle that would never fully rotate again. I spent even longer in therapy trying to convince myself that the police were right, that it was just a nightmare, that monsters don't hang from ceilings, that families don't eat their guests. I almost believed it, almost. Until last week. It's Thanksgiving again, the 1-year anniversary. I've been living in this studio apartment, keeping to myself, working freelance jobs online. I keep the lights on, always on. I told myself it was just PTSD. I told myself I was safe. But 3 days ago, I was shaving in the bathroom. The mirror was steamed up from the shower. I wiped a circle clear to see my face. I looked tired, dark circles under my eyes, pale skin, and then I saw it. On the side of my neck, right where the grandmother had stared at my jugular, there was a mark. It wasn't a bruise. It was a discoloration under the skin. It was faint purplish gray, but it had a shape. It looked like a fingerprint, a long, thin, skeletal fingerprint. I scrubbed at it until my skin was raw, but it didn't wash off. It was deep. It was in the meat. Since then, the changes have been subtle. I'm always cold. No matter how high I crank the thermostat, my bones feel like ice. Food tastes like ash except for meat, raw meat. I found myself staring at a package of ground beef in the grocery store yesterday, my mouth watering, an urge rising in my throat to tear the plastic open with my teeth. But the worst part is the reflection. Tonight, just an hour before I started writing this, I walked past a full-length mirror in the hallway. I stopped. I looked at myself. I raised my right hand. My reflection raised its left. That's normal. That's physics. But then I blinked. My reflection didn't. My reflection stood there, staring back at me with eyes that seemed a shade yellower than mine. And then slowly, horribly, the corners of my reflection's mouth curled up. It wasn't my smile. It was sharp. It was hungry. It was the smile of a man who knows dinner is finally served. I heard the voice again, not from the ceiling, not from under the bed. It came from my own throat. My vocal cords vibrated, but I wasn't trying to speak. The sound was wet, grinding, and ancient. The suit fits. I'm sitting here now under the floodlights. I have the knife. I'm trying to stay awake. I'm trying to stay me, but my skin feels tight. It feels like it's shrinking, or maybe I'm getting too big for it. I can feel my joints popping, shifting, trying to rearrange themselves into new angles. I wanted a family. I wanted to belong. I guess I got my wish. I'm part of the lineage now. If you are reading this and your partner invites you home for the holidays, check the seating arrangement, count the chairs, and if they ask you to sit at the head of the table, run. Run before the first bite. Run before the hunger sets in. Because once you're marked, you don't just join the family, you become the furniture.